Hello and happy Halloween, history lovers. Welcome to part 2 of our discussion of the history of famous monsters. Today in this video, we're going to be talking about the history of those monsters within the movies. Let's start with probably the most famous movie monster of all time, Dracula. Now, oddly enough, the first vampire movie was not Dracula. It was a ripoff of Dracula. And Bram Stoker's widow had to fight in order to get that movie stopped because it was an infringement of copyrights. Although she was not entirely successful with that.
Having no interest in her husband's work during his lifetime, Mrs. Bram Stoker actively defended it after his death. It was now her only source of income. Nosferatu was an infringement of copyright. After years of wrangling, the Prana Film Company was ordered to destroy all copies of the motion picture. As you see, the order was never completely carried out.
Before Dracula could be made into a movie, it was changed from a book into a play. But it wasn't until the revival of this play that the most famous actor to ever play Dracula would get involved. That's, of course, Bela Lugosi. Now, today we sort of link vampires with romance, which might seem like an odd idea. These days we have characters like Edward Cullen who are vampires, and everybody knows how everybody fell in love with him. But now it doesn't seem that strange that vampires had a romantic element linked to them when you consider that Bela Lugosi wasn't originally a horror actor. In his native Hungary, he was a romantic actor.
In Hungary, my father was actually a romantic lead. It wasn't until United States films, when he did such a dramatic job on the Dracula film, that he became known as a horror actor. Before that, he was a dramatic actor who was accomplished at all sorts of roles.
Little bit of trivia for you here about Bela Lugosi. Now, he'd been an actor, like I said, in his native Hungary, but he got in trouble there for standing up for actors' unions. Apparently, that was considered a bad thing to try to protect his fellow actors' rights and get them decent wages and take a stand to make sure they got decent treatment on set. Well, because of that, he ended up going to Germany and, of course, later to the US. Now, he played Dracula on stage, but he was not Universal's first choice for the role when they made the movie. He fought hard to get that role and eventually won them over. Now, here's another little bit of trivia for you. You might or might not know this, but a Spanish version of the movie was being made at the same time, using the same set and the same script.
Since dubbing was technically unfeasible in the early days of talking pictures, many films were shot in alternate languages. The Spanish version of Dracula used the same sets and even some long shots of Lugosi.
Oddly enough, even though Bela Lugosi is without doubt the most famous actor to ever play Dracula, he only officially played the role twice. He was in a lot of vampire pictures, but only twice where he officially played Dracula. Now, in order to get around the copyright on the Dracula name, Son of Dracula actually had their vampire called something else. He was Count Alucard. And if you're wondering why Count Alucard, write that down backwards.
The new Dracula cleverly disguised himself by spelling his name backward, Count Alucard. Luckily for him, none of the characters in the story was dyslexic.
I gotta say, that's one way to get around copyright rules. Now, when they finally did make another movie using the Dracula name, it wasn't Bela who was cast in the role. And although I think they made a good choice, you can't help but miss Bela. However, their choice was much closer in appearance to the way Bram Stoker described him.
House of Frankenstein was envisioned as a monster rally, with Bela Lugosi recreating his character. At the last minute, for reasons of time and money, the studio substituted Shakespearean actor John Carradine.
Universal made many movies combining the various monsters. And I'm going to talk about one movie that combines them all shortly. But now, Hammer Films started making their horror movies a couple of decades later. And this is when Christopher Lee got involved in the role. Now, if you're ever in a trivia contest and the question is who played Dracula most often, the answer is Christopher Lee. He played the role a total of 10 times.
I regarded this character as heroic, romantic, erotic, irresistible to women, unstoppable by men.
Remember that I said Bela Lugosi played Dracula only twice, even though he made many other vampire movies? The second time was in the comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This was made 17 years after the original Dracula movie, but you would never know any time past the way he played the character, just spot on, right back in character right away. He took the role incredibly seriously. In fact, he was such a serious person that everybody on set said it was hard to work with the guy. He wasn't mean tempered, he wasn't arrogant, he was a good guy. But he was just so serious, and this was supposed to be a comedy, and you could not get a laugh out of the guy. He especially wasn't happy with the way that people were actually hired to get the cast to break up into laughter on set just to keep the spirits up. For an actor as serious as him, this didn't go over well.
Very vivid memories of the antics that were going on. That was a very depressing set, like most horror sets are. And the studio had hired a couple of comedians to do cut-ups between the takes just to keep the spirits and atmosphere up.
How careless. One should be careful. A person could get killed that way.
Bela would wear the costume one more time during his life, and that was in some test footage that was used in the movie Plan 9 from Outer Space. Now, a little bit more trivia about the vampire costume. The cape was actually used as a stage prop because it let the actor playing Dracula on stage disappear when he was supposed to be being apprehended. Somebody would grab the cape and he would just work his way out of it and down through a trapdoor. Pretty cool special effect for back in the day. At his own request, when he died, Bela was actually buried in the Dracula costume. And those who were at his funeral said you could have expected a director to yell cut and see him get up. His life was always linked to Dracula, which was sad in a way because he was severely typecast. One more bit of trivia about Bela Lugosi. He was almost cast as the Frankenstein monster, but he turned it down because he felt that the makeup would limit his facial expressions, and it was a mute role. And this is an actor very well known for his voice. He felt the part was wrong for him, and he always regretted that decision. My own opinion, I think he made the right call, because I can't imagine him in that role any more than I can imagine Boris Karloff playing Dracula. Some actors were just born for certain roles, perfect for them. Now, years later, like I said earlier, vampires have always had a certain romanticism to them. Well, that got turned up to the 11s in the 1970s thanks to a soap opera called Dark Shadows. This series would end up with a character who wasn't Dracula but clearly inspired by Dracula. this is the character of Barnabas Collins. And some people might be familiar with the Johnny Depp version of Dark Shadows. It can't hold a candle to the original version. Sorry for fans of that, but in my opinion, there's only one true Barnabas Collins. Jonathan Frid took the role, figuring it would only last a few weeks. They were supposed to kill his character off after a couple weeks. The soap opera was really struggling anyway. Everybody thought it would be canceled soon. They thought, what the hell, let's add a vampire in. Nobody expected his popularity to take off right from the moment he was introduced.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
If it weren't for the clothes, forgive me for staring, but for the moment it seems as though I'd seen a
ghost.
Well, the likeness is remarkable.
Everybody fell in love with Barnabas, and it's funny because what was supposed to be a very brief stay on the show turned into the show being centered around him. And nobody could figure that out. The writers, the directors were like, why are people not afraid of him? Why are people in love with this vampire? I give credit to the actor for that. Jonathan Frid was known for saying he would never play a character who was pure good or pure evil. His take on the character was a tragic figure who had become the vampire as a result of a curse from a witch who was jealous of Barnabas's true love. So, a different take on the character, very effective, got a huge fan base in no time. So, I've talked about vampires in movies quite a bit here, and on TV, but it's time to move on to werewolves. I said in my last video that werewolves, as we know them, a lot of the mythology we think of actually comes from the movies rather than traditional mythology. And the first werewolf movie actually was not the one you're probably thinking of, which would be 1941's Wolfman starring Lon Chaney Jr. The first werewolf movie was actually The Werewolf of London.
I would say The Werewolf of London was probably one of your first Wolfman makeups, or the wolf genre makeups. Quite honestly, I think it was a better makeup than the Wolfman.
Now, this was actually the first werewolf story to connect werewolves to the moon. Although in this case, it's because of a flower that's connected to the moonlight that has any connection to being werewolves. And it's also the first werewolf story that I'm aware of to have lycanthropy spread through a bite. Now, probably the most famous werewolf movie of all time is 1941's The Wolfman starring Lon Chaney Jr. Now, there's a lot to be said about Lon Chaney Jr. His birth name was Creighton Chaney, and he is, of course, the son of Lon Chaney, who is arguably the greatest makeup artist of all time and a very talented silent film actor. He was just barely starting to break into talking pictures when he died of cancer. Lon Chaney was so good at using expression, body movements, because he was the son of deaf parents. And of course, that was how he always expressed himself, facial expressions, hand movements. And that translated over so perfectly into acting. And you could definitely see that legacy passed on in his son.
Something that he saw in himself through his father. He knew he could be able to portray not a monster, but an altered personality by means. And that's what made it challenging for him, and he enjoyed it a lot.
Whoever is bitten by a werewolf and lives becomes a werewolf himself.
Oh, don't hand me that. You're just wasting your time.
The wolf bit you, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
Werewolves can definitely be seen as tragic figures, and Lon Chaney Jr. portrayed that brilliantly. Now, being a werewolf obviously is not fun, but was even worse, and what might have helped him to portray the suffering a little was how much he suffered during the makeup process. I had no idea until recently just how bad this was. I knew it was bad, but this actually borders on torture.
For example, when Lon Chaney played the Wolfman, each appearance demanded a painstakingly filmed transformation scene. Tiny nails were often driven into the skin on Chaney's fingers to make sure he held completely still during the shooting.
I'm pretty sure that look of pain on his face is real. Now, even though this was a very unpleasant role as far as the makeup went, Lon Chaney Jr. would play the Wolfman many times. Because even though he died at the end of each movie, they always found some way that he would be brought back. Try to find a cure for being a werewolf, end up dead. Cue the next sequel where he's brought back somehow. Now, even though he really loved playing this role despite the makeup, but someone who loved it just as much, oddly enough, was Michael Landon, who would play a werewolf in I Was a Teenage Werewolf. Probably one of the corniest horror movies ever made. Michael Landon enjoyed playing this role so much that years later, when he made a series called Highway to Heaven, he actually had an episode made based on this story. So, nice to see an actor who really likes their role. I always say you can tell when the actor is having fun. Oddly enough, years later, they made a movie called Teen Wolf, but in that movie, he just basically used his physical ability as a werewolf to be really good at basketball. So, it's interesting to see how characters and different ideas can evolve over time. So, now let's talk about Frankenstein. Of course, everybody knows that the novel was written by Mary Shelley, and I really recommend reading the novel if you haven't. Way different than the movie's excellent story, excellent ideology in it. So I think a lot of readers would really enjoy that one as much today as they did when it first came out. And again, Mary Shelley is a subject for a whole video just on her own. She was really an incredible person, went through a lot in her life, really amazing writer. There's a lot to be said about her, but I'll do that video next Halloween. Now, the first Frankenstein movie was actually made by Thomas Edison, even though it's the Boris Karloff version that everybody remembers. Actually made in 1910, so this is going way back as far as movies go.
The 1910 Edison version of Frankenstein runs from 7 to 12 minutes. The film was long thought to be lost for 60 or 70 years before being rediscovered in the mid-1980s. The monster was portrayed by Charles Ogle, an Edison Company player who covered himself with glop in order to resemble a pretty hilarious-looking monster.
Of course, it's the next version of Frankenstein, the Boris Karloff version, that is the most recognizable to anybody who is thinking of the Frankenstein's monster. Now, a note on that. Bela Lugosi turned down the role, and there was a lot of talk going on that there were hard feelings between him and Boris Karloff afterward. This is not true. They weren't exactly close, they just happened to move in different social circles, each had their own group of friends, but there was nothing but respect between the two. They were competitors for roles, but that didn't mean they had any dislike for each other. They didn't, and they worked together many times, had a good working relationship when they did. Now, Boris Karloff really liked this role, and he saw a lot to be brought to the character.
Well, it was extremely interesting because it was a sort of a challenge. Here you were playing an inarticulate creature with a half-formed brain that was barely functioning, but bit by bit was beginning to function more and more and more. And still you had to communicate.
Now, I talked about the pain that Lon Chaney Jr. went through in the makeup. Boris Karloff didn't have an easy time either, simply from the sheer weight of everything he had to wear. The boots themselves were 16 pounds each.
All told, the whole outfit weighed about 40 to 45 pounds.
Oh, he had back trouble for years and years, and I think he had 3 back surgeries.
Now, of course, Frankenstein was a huge success, and if you're a movie maker and you have a huge success, what do? You make a sequel, of course. Actually, Bride of Frankenstein is considered an even better picture by many critics than the original. And it also gave us a character who we always associate with the Frankenstein mythology, but he wasn't in the books. He wasn't in the first movie. It actually was not until the second Frankenstein movie of the Boris Karloff series that we got Igor. And guess who played him?
Even though the character only appeared in 2 motion pictures, Lugosi made Igor so memorable that the name was linked to all wicked assistants, in the same way the name Frankenstein was associated with his monstrous creation.
Oddly enough, even though it was the role of Dracula that made Bela Lugosi so famous, this was one of his favorite roles. He played the character twice in Bride of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein, and here we can see a bit of footage from that, seeing how he plays the role of Igor, and also some commentary from his son on just why he liked playing the part of Igor.
Father was Frankenstein. That your mother was delightfully.
When I spoke to my father about what his favorite roles had been over the years, Igor in The Son of Frankenstein was one of his favorites, and I asked him why, and he said he hardly ever got a chance to do comedy, and there were some parts of that role which had a comedic timing to it, and that he liked.
It's kind of funny to think that even though it was Bela Lugosi had a reputation as someone who was hard to joke with on set, he did like playing a role that he saw as comedic. I guess he just had a little different view of comedy than other actors do. Now, after Son of Frankenstein, Boris Karloff said, "I've done as much as I can with this role. There's really nothing more to add to the character." So for Ghost of Frankenstein, they said, let's get Lon Chaney Jr. to play the monster. Isn't it fascinating how different actors played multiple movie monsters, how they were all together in multiple movies? You can't really talk about one without talking about the others. Now, I've said that there was no hard feelings between Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, and there weren't. They had a nice, respectful relationship. However, there were hard feelings between Lon Chaney Jr. and Boris Karloff.
He was very jealous of Boris Karloff. Yeah, because he said exactly, that guy's not one damn bit better than I am.
Lon Chaney Jr. might not have had the best relationship with Boris Karloff, but he did get along very well with the next actor to play the Frankenstein monster, and that was Glenn Strange. There was one story told that they were on set, and there was this one part where Lon Chaney Jr., of course, was playing the character of the Wolfman, and in his human form, he comes across the Frankenstein's monster buried under a bunch of mud, half alive, and they said filming that was freezing. They were in this cave, and Glenn Strange had to be half buried in the mud. It was so cold. And Lon Chaney Jr. came out to him after and said, "Here, take a drink of this, it'll warm you up," and he had some whiskey for him. and they joked around on set, got along fairly well. Boris Karloff is without doubt the most famous actor to play the Frankenstein monster, but Glenn Strange played him more often than any other actor, with a somewhat sad result.
Altogether, Glenn Strange played the monster more times than any other actor. In fact, when Boris Karloff died in 1968, it was a photo of Strange that actually accompanied Boris's obituary.
That's pretty sad that the obituary didn't even use the right photo. Now, Lon Chaney Jr. would play the role again in a television anthology series called Tales of Tomorrow. I haven't had the chance to see this, but from what I've heard, it's a pretty faithful retelling of the book. There is some sadness that goes along with that, too. Lon Chaney Jr. was a heavy drinker and actually collapsed on set, didn't work again for 3 more years. You gotta feel sorry for the guy. Now, of course, there have been so many movie adaptations of Frankenstein that, talking about each of these monsters has made me realize I could do an hour-long video on any individual one of them. But in doing a combination talking about all these monsters, I can't leave off without talking about my personal favorite adaptation of the Frankenstein story, and that is the comedy movie Young Frankenstein. To me, this is a Halloween staple. You gotta love this movie.
Would you mind telling me whose brain I did put in? Then you won't be angry. I will not be angry. Happy someone. Happy someone. Happy who? Happy normal.
If you haven't seen this movie, check it out for Halloween. It is one of the greatest Halloween movies of all time. It's kind of funny how horror and comedy always seem to go together, but this movie is pure comedy gold from start to finish. I could include a lot of moments from it, but I could make a whole video again just on that. I've had to leave out a lot of trivia in this video just for time's sake because, like I said, there is a wealth of material here. But one thing I wanted to mention, in Young Frankenstein, they used the same props and sets as in the original Boris Karloff movie. Now, in that movie, the set designers were uncredited. This time, Mel Brooks made sure they got credits. Got credit for what they'd done. I need to make a correction before. I think I misspoke and said that Igor was in Bride of Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein. He was in Son of Frankenstein and Ghost of Frankenstein. Now again, there's so much trivia I could give about any of these. It's been a lot of fun making this video, and I will definitely make more History of Monster videos in the future for Halloween. I hope you've enjoyed this. Have a happy Halloween, and take care.